Hello everyone, welcome to Gender and Politics. So for today's video, we will be talking about thinking about gender and judging. I am Joleene Aira G Sibayan from BSENTREP 3 and I will be discussing our topic for today. First, let us look at the topics to be discussed. Number 1 is the introduction, a brief explanation about how gender is a social process and how sex difference affect the selection of judges in the world of politics. Second will be the main topics. Four topics will be discussed: the difference between sex and gender, sex as a variable, seeing gender one judge at a time, and the other effects of women on the bench. The third one is the subtopics. Five subtopics will be explained under the topic of sex as a variable, and a presented video example will be shown as well. Then lastly, the conclusion, a wrap-up about the lesson and to summarize the main key points of thinking about gender and judging. How should we think about sex and gender differences in ways that are theoretically sophisticated, empirically true, and do not lead to women's disadvantages? For 30 years, political scientists have been thinking about this problem, examining and carefully understanding how sex and gender works in the world of politics, especially in the jurisdiction and legal systems. Yet rarely does that work incorporate the insights of political scientists. APT, since political scientists advance gender theory, apply social science research methods, and understand judicial selection as a political process. As Sally J. Kenny reviews the works of the three pioneering scholars, Beverly Blair Cook, Elaine Martin, and Sue Davis, since they theorize gender as a social process rather than treat sex as an essential difference. They investigate sex differences empirically rather than assume them. In this presentation, we test and see gender beyond the question, do women judges decide cases differently than men? Does the qualification for being part of the jurisdiction and legal system have anything to do with the sex and gender differences? Let's find out to fully understand the concept of thinking about gender and judging. Our first topic, what is sex and gender? What are their differences and how do we make people understand more about them? As we all know, sex and gender has been confusing by some, as they thought that these two words are the same or reverse meanings. Sex is based on their private parts, their biological differences, and physiological characteristics of male and females. While gender, on the other hand, describes as the social process rather than an essential dichotomous difference, and use the word as both an adjective, gendered, as well as a verb. Gender differentiation is found everywhere, which activities or attributes becomes the basis of differentiation, vary even within different groups, classes, or races of the same society at the same time, as well as across time and culture. And as time had passed, gender has been expressed in so many different ways that today in this generation there are now a community called LGBTQIA+, that consists of many that functions as an umbrella term for their sexuality and gender identities. The LGBTQIA+ stands for L, lesbians, G for gays, B for bisexuals, T for transgenders, Q for queers, I for intersex, A for asexuals or aromantic or agenders, and many more gender identities recognized by the society. Using gender to mean a sex binary may distort or conceal as much as it illuminates. Scientists have shown repeatedly that women differ as much from other women as they do from men, whether the attributes are strength, mathematical reasoning ability, or the ability to calm toddlers. Although society has determined what practices should be attributed to masculinity or femininity, some people fall in what is expected and some don't. But that doesn't necessarily determine their gender identity. In the Western culture, your hairstyle, choice of clothing, and even in their partners are gendered. If you are different, then that is what they disapprove of. If you're a female and your favorite color is blue, it shall not be accepted by many and force you to change it into pink. But now, as society begins to accept these changes, anyone is free to express of their interests. The same can be applied for activities, hobbies, or jobs like construction work, shopping, or playing sports. When your gender expression doesn't align with the sex you were assigned at birth, you might encounter confusion or negative reactions. Still, gender nonconformity is becoming more acceptable, but anyone is allowed to decide their own gender, not from others. Now let's move on to the next topic, sex as a variable. We talk about how sex differences affect the flow of judging and how the cases are decided. The terms sex and gender are often used interchangeably within the general community. However, although highly related, sex and gender are distinct concepts. By bringing these two concepts together into a single standard, it is possible to explain the relationship between them and provide context for their appropriate use. In practice, it is expected that most users will need to collect only one of sex or gender to meet their statistical needs. If we could find a way about tendencies and overlaps, if sex were one variable among many, feminist scholars may not have to be so worried about essentialism. Besides the danger of overgeneralization that lead to claims of a false dichotomy, such research may wrongly claim sex to be the same explanation when sex masks other determinants. President Carter, for example, appointed more judges to the federal bench than all presidents combined, and a higher percentage of women judges than any president until President Clinton. If one finds sex differences among federal judges, it may merely be an artifact of the appointing president. But if one avoids this second pitfall by controlling for party, ideology, even such things as experience as a persecutor versus experience as a public defender, then one is left with the concept of sex as a residual variable. Identity categories work in many interesting ways that are pattern if not true for all members of the group. Not all black women think alike, but black women lawyers who went to law school in the 1970s were likely to have had many common experiences. By stripping away class, race, sexual orientation to drill down to the core of what constitutes sex differences, one inevitably approaches sex as a biological category instead of gender as a social process. Women judges in the political opportunity structure. Unfortunately, comparisons between man and woman continue to expose unfairness. Such an approach has radical implications for thinking about the best process for choosing judges. A video will be presented of the perspective from the bench about gender and judging, told by Judge Diane Sykes at the Duke University.
All this focus on the fact that our newest justices are women raises some important questions about gender and judging. I've always been a little uncomfortable with the implications and consequences of gender identity politics, or any identity politics for that matter, and particularly so in matters of judicial selection. But mine may not be the prevailing view. Dahlia Lithwick noted in her column that with women claiming a large share of responsibility for Obama's victory over John McCain, the demand for a more gender-balanced Supreme Court is stronger than ever. She suggested as well that there might be something about the way that women decide cases that makes the need for them more urgent. And she even went so far as to say that President Obama owes us another woman justice. I suppose there's a purely political explanation for the conventional wisdom that the recent vacancies on the Supreme Court would be filled by women. But I'm less interested in the symbolic aspects of this issue than the substantive, the extent to which gender does or should make any difference in judging. If the case is being made for the appointment of women judges just because they are women, then I think we are making a mistake about the qualities necessary in a good judge, which of course are not gender specific. If the case is being made for the appointment of women judges because they subscribe to a gender-based brand of judging, then we are making an even bigger mistake about the nature of the judicial role. To assign gender a kind of qualifying significance risks diminishing the contributions of women judges by emphasizing their gender as if it had something to do with their qualifications for judicial office or has substantive significance in their work.
Beverly Blair Cook found women more likely to find a place on the bench through appointment rather than election, and that having women on appointing panels increases the number of women chosen. Political scientists will continue to explore whether the type of selection system affects the number of women selected. After Cook, Elaine Martin is a political scientist with the most sustained body of work on women judges. Like Cook, she used sex as a variable to see if presidents use different criteria for choosing men and women judges. In 1982, Martin explored the disparate impact of using the criterion of being well known by senior judges as the basis for choosing judges. Her survey found that 43% of the women felt that they would not have been considered under the previous system rather than merit selection because they lacked the political influence and credentials. President Carter was looking for women with profound commitment to equal justice under the law, and 90% of the women he appointed had accepted pro bono work or worked for legal aid. 90% shown a demonstrable commitment to feminism. If Carter's women judges behave differently than men once on the bench, it might well be because he carefully chose them from among feminists rather than because of either an essential female difference or from having experienced life as a woman. Presidents seem to hold women to a higher standard of experience either as a judge or a prosecutor than men. Studies by Citizens for Independent Courts showed that the Senate took 5 months to take action on Clinton's male appointees, while they took 8 months to take action on female and minority appointees. Ambition is a social construction, not an inherent sex trait that boys or girls either have or lack at birth. Rather, it is nourished in some and discouraged in others. In fact, through very social processes such as how judicial nominating commissions treat applicants. Evidence demonstrated that the Maryland Judicial Nominating Commission treated men and women with aspirations for the bench differently. Commissioners perceived women as apathy for seeking to rise above their station. Conversely, commissioners regarded men who applied for judgeships as lacking in ambition since judgeships paid far less than practice in a large firm. In the same study, Martin also surveyed women judges attending the 1986 annual meeting of the National Association of Women Judges and compared them to a sample of men judges. She modified Cook's protocol but asked questions that allowed her to plot the gender ideology of judges and then analyzed whether that led to differences in answers on increasing the number of women judges, on women judges' behavior, on perceptions of gender bias in the courts, and hypothetical cases that traced gender issues from battered women to divorce and to abortion. However, women judges disagreed about the different gender mix. Women judges, feminists and non-feminists were more likely than men feminists to agree with the statements that women judges behave differently from men, that they have an ability to bring people together, and that they have faced special problems in the justice system, though it did not make a great result since it was more focused on getting the opinion rather than observing the behavior of women judges. More recently, sociologist Patricia Yancy Martin examined Florida judges and found that compared with men judges and attorneys, women judges and attorneys were more conscious of gender inequality, observed more gender bias in legal settings, and showed a stronger connection between experiences with gender bias and feminist consciousness. Drawing on feminist standpoint theory, however, Martin and company argued that feminist consciousness is a political achievement, not an automatic consequence of being a woman or experiencing life as a woman. Women observed more gender bias dynamics and were more likely than men to agree with a variety of feminist principles, ranging from property division post-divorce to rejecting rape myths and negative stereotypes about domestic violence. The findings held across race. While not making claims directly for outputs, Martin and company argued that the presence of women judges will make the legal system more objective, more legitimate in the eyes of the women complainants, and help all judges raise their consciousness on these issues. Sue Davis' status of judges on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, 1992 to 1993, was grounded in feminist theory. She acknowledged the critics of Gilligan as well as the ways in which scholars often misread or misinterpret her work, recognizing that finding a different female or a feminine voice in one-woman juries hardly proves anything about the category of women. Davis searched for evidence of the different voice by pairing women judges on the Ninth Circuit with their most similar men. Men appointed by the same president, similar in education and background at a similar location on the liberal-conservative spectrum. She concluded with the agnosticism as to whether Gilligan was wrong altogether as applied to the judiciary, or whether the sort of women who became federal judges are the sort of women who think like men. Paradoxically, her findings did not lead her to a strong criticism of Gilligan or to reject the different voice as a way to frame gender and judging. Instead, she leaves us with the possibility that the wrong sort of women serve on the bench, or that the male system overpowers the feminist voice. Calling for further study, Davis and company ended by pointing out that until women's different approaches to legal reasoning are welcome in the study of law, we will not really know whether women have a distinctive impact on the legal system. Implicit in their conclusion was the assumption that women are different, and we just have not been clever enough to uncover that difference empirically. They recognized that women could be more attentive to discrimination generally because of their experiences rather than because they reason in a different voice. But they then returned to the different voice as a dominant frame. They then mused whether law school stamps out the different voice in favor of rights and hierarchies, suggesting that it represses that different voice in everything but discrimination cases. Rather than seeing law silencing women judges' different voice, perhaps what we see in Davis is political science repressing Davis' more anti-essentialist approach over time. Although she started with a disfavored topic, how gender affects judging, she begins with doctrinal analysis, perhaps the discipline's least approved of method. She moves to a statistical analysis of opinion and at last to a predictive model. In the process, however, we lose a critical eye of sophistication of feminist theory with which she began. The different voice frame thus becomes more conservative and essentialist. What is striking is that further she moves down the path of statistical analysis, the farther away we get from any real support of the different voice with the possible exception of sex discrimination cases. Yet Gilligan remains firmly entrenched as a dominant gender frame. Research on state Supreme Courts, the U.S. Courts of Appeal, and the U.S. Supreme Court consistently has shown what women judges tend to be the strongest supporters of women's rights claims, regardless of their ideology. Yet even finding has varied depending on the time period. In her 2003 essay for the U.S. David Law Review, reviewing political science studies of whether men and women decide cases differently, legal academic Teresa Boehner is forced to conclude that the effects of race and gender of judge are inconclusive. In a recent example, Jennifer Siegel studied President Clinton's judicial appointees to the district courts and found that the traditional judges to be more liberal than the non-traditional appointees. Even one might concede that as Clinton faced a Republican-dominated Senate, he knew that women nominees faced more intense scrutiny than men. One can hardly conclude based upon Siegel's finding that Clinton's women appointees spoke in a distinctive feminine or feminist voice. Jennifer Perisy, however, examined how over a 3-year period where the doctrine was relatively stable, the presence of female judges on 3-judge federal appellate panels affected collegial outcomes in Title VII cases on sexual harassment and sex discrimination. She found that plaintiffs were twice as likely to prevail a woman judge on the bench. The presence of a woman judge increased the probability that a man judge would support the plaintiff. Interestingly, Perisy found men and women judges more different from each other on an individual level in sexual harassment cases, but the influence of women judges greater in sex discrimination cases. Perisy lacked an adequate theoretical account of these differences. Boyd and company also found that the presence of a woman on the panel hearing a sex discrimination case made it more likely that the panel would result a pro-plaintiff decision. They believed that the effect to be deliberative and to result in men changing their behavior. But although we are looking at the Michigan Supreme Court over time, we are still explaining variance of a small number of people and small number of women and minority men. So we assume gender, not feminism, leads to a difference in votes in discrimination cases. And when we do not find it, we explain it away by referring to a particular details of the case itself. This telling phrasing reveals her belief that finally women's true difference from men in the form of their gender life experience will be evident in their decision making. Martin labeled she hopes to find a representative voice. She found that women judges are more likely than men to support a woman litigant in divorce cases. This difference is more pronounced if there are 3 women on the court, but less if there are 2, a non-linear relationship Martin cannot explain. Men are more supportive of women litigants when they serve with only one woman and less likely if they are chosen by merit systems. A common story draws on one reading of Cantor that women tokens isolated on the bench or in their profession behave just like men, but once women reach critical mass their true defenses can emerge. The evidence that Martin and Cook have gathered on women judges in the United States suggests that earliest women judges may have been most openly feminist with the exception of Justice O'Connor. Davis tested for a different voice, failed to find it and left us with a view that it is masked rather than does not exist. Pharisees' jury could not explain why a woman member of the panel influenced sex discrimination cases more than sexual harassment cases, rather than continuing to repeat the running of sex as a variable to test for the different voice. I think it is time for rethinking our theories of gender and judging where Cook began and Martin and company developed. On our third topic, seeing gender one judge at a time, we will see how both sides act inside and outside the court, what their perspective and belief may be. One of the most troubling strands of argument in the field of gender and judging has been the assertion that Justice O'Connor used communitarian, holistic, theological, and contextual reasoning, dubbed the feminine voice, rather than liberal, individualistic, atomistic, non-theological, abstract, and rule-based reasoning. No one could credibly argue that Justice O'Connor has a distinctively feminist voice, although she did take a feminist position on some issues, particularly relative to her more conservative colleagues, but her gender arguably mattered because she deployed a distinctively feminine style of reasoning. In a recent interview, the first female justice on the U.S. Supreme Court emphatically denied that the gender of a judge has anything to do with the way he or she decide cases. There is simply no empirical evidence that gender differences lead to discernible difference in rendering judgment. Justice O'Connor agreed with that concept during an interview with Judy Woodruff. However, Justice Wilson contradicted the opinion of Justice O'Connor. She believes that there is overwhelming evidence that gender-based myths, biases, and stereotypes are deeply embedded in the attitudes of many male judges. Gender difference has been a significant factor in the judicial decision-making, particularly in the areas of tort law, criminal law, and family law. Women might conduct their trial courtrooms differently from men by refusing to allow well-documented sexist behavior, because they might act differently as administrators. For example, hiring more women law clerks. Men lawyers and men judges might moderate their behavior as might as women jurors, lawyers, and litigants. In many but not all cases, a women justice on a state Supreme Court called for the creation of a state gender bias task force, and women judges were almost always leaders in establishing race bias task force. The authors deserve praise for looking the significance of gender beyond dichotomous votes on cases and noting that as administrations of their state's judicial systems, chief judges can advance reforms such as those concerning juvenile courts, family courts, gender bias studies, and battered women's programs. The study uncovered enormous variation among the chief judges, men and women, and on women issues. While the presence of a woman chief judge positively and significantly impacted the likelihood of mentioning a woman's issue, the number of mentions does not increase with an increased number of women on the court. Rather, it had the opposite effect. They found no statistical significance for the claim that women chief justices are more likely to make women's issues a priority. To wrap it all up, here are the key points of our topic for today. So that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope you understand the concept of our topic.